I'm Tim Ventura, and in this presentation, Dr. John Brandenburg outlines a model for Martian panspermia based on new sample discoveries from Antarctic meteorites and asks whether life on Mars, Earth, and potentially other planets originated in space. This challenges the traditional view of life arising spontaneously from a primordial soup on Earth and suggests that life may be widespread across the universe.
Thank you very much, Tim. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. And once again, we'll try this again. A pleasure and honor to be addressing you all, and I'll run through this fairly straightforwardly. Basically, the new information is in Australia, they've now found what are called stromatolites. They're in modern times, they're a mineralization deposit around green, blue-green algae. And this is one of the earliest things to live on Earth. And these things are now, they've established they're 3.5 billion years old. And I'll show you why this is so significant. Next thing, please. Okay, to cross the Rubicon means to make an irrevocable decision or to reach a point of no turning back. You basically, you make a decision, you cross the river, and you're not going back. You burned your bridge, and it's my thesis that the human race must decide, based on strong evidence, that it is not alone. Scientific discoveries are ultimately a decision, and that other life exists in the stars around us. Next, please. Okay, I'll talk about, whoops, go back, please. Okay, I'll talk about panspermia is now confirmed by a discovery of fossil life signs in 3.48 billion year old Australian rock. The Earth is only 4.5 billion years old. We'll be talking about confirmation of this from CI meteorites, which are loaded with microfossils and organics, and they are probably from Mars, and this is very consistent with panspermia. So we have panspermia has been, strong evidence for panspermia has been found in Australia, and the work from Mars is consistent with that in terms of organic matter found in old lake bed sediments on Mars, strong signs of methane and oxygen emissions found on Mars indicating microbial activity at present. So we had Mars past life and Mars present life. And then vivid and changeable color areas on Jupiter suggesting aeroplankton, which is a phenomenon they find on Earth in the clouds. And this is consistent also with life. So then I'll summarize and conclude. Next, please. Okay, the first billion years, roughly, of the Earth's life, or rather the Earth's existence, was what was called the Hadean epoch, or hellish epoch, from Hades in the Greek. So about 4.5 to 3.5 billion years ago, this place was full of seas of molten lava, volcanoes constantly erupting, constant impacts. Of course, there was the big impact that apparently formed the moon. I find that theory to be the best theory available for how the moon formed. And so there was no liquid water at that time. Next. Now, these features called stromatolites are found in the very old exposed Pilbara Craton body of rock in Australia. It's in the Australian outback, used to be part of an ocean or a lake bed. And so these fossil remains of algae colonies are 4.5 billion years old. So the Hadean era had basically only barely ended when these things were formed with liquid water. So algae colonies existed on Earth as soon as the surface cooled enough for liquid water, apparently. Spontaneous generation, which is the old theory, the present theory, in fact, of life from the primordial soup on the early Earth, sloshing around back and forth, and then suddenly out of this comes living cells with cell walls, nuclei, um, RNA, DNA, enzymes, all of that stuff. That's no longer viable. I mean, there isn't time to develop that sort of stuff by random chance. You'd have to say, oh, life came about miraculously on Earth. Uh, it's like somebody being born and quoting Shakespeare is these blue-green algae formations this close to the Hadean era where there was no liquid water. So the simplest explanation is that life is seeded elsewhere in the cosmos, panspermia. Now, Earth is 4.5 billion years old. The universe is 13 billion years old. And so life began. What this does, it doesn't explain how life began in the universe. What it says is that you basically evaded the question of the details of how life originated. You're basically just saying it originated in some galaxy a long time ago, far, far away. So you basically said we don't really care about the process that started the life. The universe is so much older than the Earth. It started someplace and it spread here. And next, please. Okay, stromatolites are formed by blue-green algae. The cyanobacteria, also called cyanobacteria, meaning blue-green bacteria, are photosynthetic, possessing DNA, RNA, enzymes, chlorophyll. These are very ancient, yet they're very sophisticated. They're very highly organized. And so the first billion years of Earth was Hadean and mostly lava and large impacts, no liquid water. And we can't, it's almost impossible to believe that you could form sophisticated life in this brief period of liquid water that existed between the Hadean era of liquid lava oceans to liquid water oceans. And so this leaves about only 1/2 billion years for cyanobacteria to evolve from primordial soup. Now, if that actually happened, that means life is very likely. And then that means it's everywhere because it means that life is a very likely event. That means that there's life in the stars because it started on Earth so quickly. Now, if life is unlikely, which is the present understanding, is that life is very complicated and almost impossible to arrive at by random chance, in a primordial soup slopping around, then cyanobacteria came from someplace else, panspermia, from an earlier epoch of the cosmos, a 13 billion year old age, and has spread everywhere. And that is the most likely explanation at this point. Next. Now, these are what stromatolites look like in modern. You can find them on ocean shorelines, especially down in Australia. And they're algae colonies that form minerals around them. And these are modern ones right on the ocean shoreline, and these are fossil ones in the outback on the right. So that's what they look like, and they're 3.5 billion years old. Next. Now, we can make the hypothesis that life on Earth arrived elsewhere from space. either far or near. It doesn't matter where specifically. But uh, it would be likely that it came from outside the solar system because Mars and Jupiter and stuff, they formed at the same time the Earth did. And they formed with similar conditions as the Earth, roughly. So panspermia means life on Mars and Earth. They also got seeded. So if we have strong evidence for panspermia on Earth, then we look for confirmation of this on Mars and Jupiter, two nearby planets, which should have also been seeded from space. And Mars looked a lot different in the past. It had a big ocean. I discovered that actually, though NASA will not give me credit. And credit I can get from a bank. It's okay. It's just science. And here's Jupiter, of course, which we'll discuss in a little bit. Next. Now, life on Mars, past and present. Ancient meteorites from Mars are full of organic residues, indicating past life, consistent with past life. One of the most famous was ALH 8401. I looked at the data they found, and it looked like they found life on Mars. And I believe they'll eventually get credit for that. And so ALH 8401 was a very ancient rock. It was about 4 billion years old. ETA 7901 is actually a more recent rock, and it also has a bunch of organic residues, meaning whatever organic source of organic matter on Mars there was, it lasted a long time. It lasted most of Mars history. So, next. Now, we have rovers roving around Mars, and here is one it's inside a big crater that used to hold a lake. They've dug down into the rocks, and they found in this old lake bed formation organic matter, complex organic matter. So it's consistent with past biology. So we have now organic matter consistent with past life on Mars. And we found it on Mars. Next. Now, we also know that on Mars, we have two gases that are biologically generated on Earth. One is methane, that's swamp gas. And it turns out that during the coldest parts of the year, there's hardly any methane. But then during the summer, all the way through to the fall on Mars, the amount of methane in the air gets elevated, meaning the bacteria gets warmer and wakes up and starts, what it's doing is breaking down old fossil organic matter and getting energy out of that. And the waste product is methane. And same as on Earth in a swamp. Now, also what happens is at the same time and matching the same pattern, during the summer and autumn on Mars, the oxygen level in the Martian atmosphere goes up. Oxygen is the fourth most abundant molecule in the Martian atmosphere, and it's made by photosynthesis. So you have photosynthetic bacteria, apparently. Its metabolism gets more active during the summer and autumn when it's warmer on Mars, and it starts making more oxygen. So we have something that's making methane, which is a hydrogen-rich gas formed by bacteria that break down organic matter and get energy from that, fossil organic matter. And then that's why you find it methane in coal mines. And then you have oxygen formed by surface bacteria, which is photosynthesis. So both those chemicals are rather unlikely chemicals to be formed on Mars now, but there they are. And this means that Mars not only had past life, it has present life. and that is consistent. These biosignatures are consistent with the panspermia evidence we find on Earth. Next. Now, I happened to discover and published that a certain type of meteorite that was known to have more organic matter than any other type of meteorite, it's got 2% by weight organic matter, and people had reported microfossils in it. They're very ancient. They're roughly like 4 billion years old. They're a watery clay mixed with tar. They're basically old lake bottom from someplace. They originate from a warm, wet place, rich in organic matter, like an old lake bottom that's dried up. Microfossils have been found in them. Richard Hoover, a PhD, who's a NASA scientist until he retired, took the lead in finding that he would split open rock that had never been exposed to air and use scanning electron microscopes. I'll be showing you the pictures. And he found microfossils in them. Now, there's another type of meteorite that's closely related, discovered by the Japanese, called CY. And they are CI meteorites that you basically put in an oven and heated as if they were they were near a lava flow or something. They were heated, then ejected into space from someplace and reached Mars. So we know the CI and the CY both have identical isotopes. So we know they come from the same place. But that place also not only has just had warm, wet, rich organic matter, but it also had occasionally geothermal heat, like a volcano. And this would heat some of this lake bottom, and before it was ejected into space. And of course, the other lake bottom was just ejected into space by some other impact. So now, people have done now sample returns from 2 asteroids. And these asteroids orbit between Mars and Earth. So they sample Mars space. Now, remember, we have a lot of meteorites from Mars now, close to 1,000 of them. Mars is next to the asteroid belt. It gets hit with asteroids and it blows some of the surface rock on Mars out into space, and it forms a belt of material orbiting the sun in the Mars orbit roughly. And eventually this gets perturbed by the gravity of Mars and even of Jupiter, and ends up on orbits that intersect the Earth's orbit. And so these rocks end up on Earth. So we know there's a cloud of debris in the Mars orbit that ends up being on Earth. These 2 asteroids, Ryugu and Bennu, orbit through that belt of material that's in the Mars orbit. Next. Now, Richard Hoover has gone and split open some of these CI meteorites, and he finds, using scanning electron microscopes, all these fibers and microfossils and things like that. Quite frankly, guys, these things crawl with fossil life. Now, that's called a CI. There's a different, distinct type of meteorite that's also rich in kind of watery clay. It isn't as rich in organics as the CI. They're called CM meteorites. And they apparently just come from the asteroid belt. People are happy with that because they only had enough water in them to indicate like some melted ice. But anyway, they also have bacteria in them in scanning electron microscopes. And Richard Hoover discovered this and published it. And he basically takes rocks that have never been split open and exposed to air, does that in a vacuum chamber, and then does the scanning electron microscope and finds these bacterial fossils. Remember, guys, all you need to do is find one microfossil, and you've proven that there's life elsewhere in the universe. All it takes is one microfossil, and they've found billions of them in these rocks from outer space. Next. Now, this is what the two asteroids look like. They're both kind of remnants of larger bodies that have been hit by big impacts. That's why they form this kind of shape. They've actually put rocks in vacuum chambers and hit them with hypervelocity pellets, and they form this kind of shape. It's sort of two cones stuck base to base. So here's Ryugu. The Japanese landed on that with a spacecraft, scooped up some rock from its surface, the rocky, powdered soil, and then took off and brought it back to Earth. And then this is the asteroid Bennu on the right. That was a NASA return mission. And both of these asteroids, next slide, please, orbit near Mars. They basically orbit near the Earth, part of their orbit, and then they orbit out by Mars. So if there's a there has to be a cloud of debris around Mars, which is the source of the Mars meteorites. So they're orbiting through it. And for every kilogram of Mars rock that is blasted into space, probably 10 kilograms of just pure dust are blasted into space, pulverized rock. And that forms this kind of almost like a belt of Jupiter or something around Mars in its orbit. So these two asteroids actually orbit through that layer, and they're basically like flypaper. They collect the dust, and that coats its surface. And the surfaces are very dark. So now they have samples from both of these asteroids back here on Earth, and they tested them. Next. Now, here we have, again, there's a belt of material around Mars orbit caused by the source for the Mars meteorites we pick up on Earth, but it's also full of dust, fine particles, which end up on these asteroids, and the asteroids orbit through it, Bennu and Ryugu, and they get coated with that material. So they are picking up that from that cloud of debris. That's what's coating their surface. And so that's what we brought back to Earth. Next. Now, how do you tell if something, you're walking along in Antarctica and you find a rock sitting on the ice? How do you know where that rock came from? Did it just come from Earth somehow? Was it blown out of a volcano on Earth, or did it fall from space? And in Antarctica, most of the volcanoes are dormant. So it's more likely that they fell, any rock you find on the ice, you fell out of space. So now you look at oxygen, which is part of all the rocks, and oxygen has 3 isotopes. It has 18, 17, and 16. And you can ratio, 16 is the most abundant, so you ratio the 16 to 17 ratio and the 18 to 16 ratio. And this gives you a map. And you can map, I'll show you a more elaborate map, but this one just shows where the Mars lava meteorites come from. Also on that line, every rock on Earth and even rocks from the moon fall on what's called the Earth moon fractionation line. So that's how we know that the moon and the Earth were both formed from the same stuff. This idea that the moon was somehow captured from the outer asteroid belt, that's just not supported by this. Vesta is an asteroid out in the asteroid belt, which got hit apparently by some big other asteroid and contributed a family of meteorites to the Earth, which is picked up. And they, as you can see, they're in blue and they lie down there. So the Mars lavas lie on a parallel line to the Earth and moon rocks on this fractionation line. And then also, if you mix water with the rock, if the rock was exposed to water so it gets becomes clay, it follows that dotted line. And it just keeps going. Next. Now, we brought back these rocks and dust from Bennu. Where do they fit on this three isotope plot, so-called? Now remember, oxygen is very important because it's one of the most abundant elements in the universe and it combines with everything. Oxygen is part of everything. The Earth's crust is, despite being rock, is actually about half by weight of oxygen. So we have the Mars lavas, and then we follow that line up that fractionation line, the parallel to terrestrial and lunar fractionation line. And if we follow that parallel line above the Earth moon line, then we get, we run into Ryugu. And if we keep going, we run into Bennu. Bennu is the bright red square. And lying in between those two is the CI meteorites. So the stuff from the outer surface of these two asteroids, which orbit near Mars, is CI. It's powdered CI. And in fact, the Bennu lies right on the boundary between the CY and the CI. The CY being heated CY. The CY being CI material that was apparently heated geothermally. So the source for the CI material and the CY material apparently lies, the only thing that's out there is Mars. So this means the CY and the CI meteorites, which end up in chunks on Earth, they pick them up in Antarctica especially, they come from Mars. Next. Now, here's a more elaborate plot, and it shows like there's the CM asteroid type meteorites. They lie below the terrestrial fractionation line. You see the circled I circled Mars in red. That's the Mars lavas. And then if you follow the dotted line up the fractionation line, the Earth fractionation line, it runs right through the sea ice. Now, I discovered this back in 1996 and published it. I got it published in a regular journal. This created a firestorm because everybody realized this meant there was life on Mars because the sea come from someplace that was alive. They've got microfossils in them. They've got organic matter. They look like old lake bottom from someplace. And apparently that lake bottom was on Mars, a warm, wet place in the past. So now we know where the CI come from and the CY too. And of course, if you have something material, the CI, and then you have, you heat it, it turns into CY. And we know that Mars has a lot of volcanic activity. It's got giant volcanoes, and there were a lot of old extinct volcanoes that were smaller on its surface. So we know that there was a lot of geothermal heating on Mars that converted the old lake bottom, dried up lake bottom on Mars into this high temperature form called CY. So now we know where the CI comes from. I told everybody they came from Mars back in 1996, but like I said, this created a firestorm. It was the most cited article, scientific article I've ever written because everybody was saying something nasty about it. Oh, Brandenburg is a terrible person. I had one person call me up on the phone and scream at me over the phone that what I had done by publishing this article was not science. He says, it's not science. So, and the reason is once you accept that the CI are from Mars, it means Mars was alive in the past. Now, that was 30 years ago. I think we've advanced now to the point where people can accept it now. So I'll be putting a paper into the Lunar Planetary Science Conference where I talk about this CI being from Mars business again. So, next, please. So the CI and the CY come from Mars, consistent with past life on Mars. And what this is a consistency test. If we find evidence for panspermia on Earth, where we can take all sorts of measurements, we can go down and look at these rocks, take pictures of them, handle them, this and that, take them back to labs, slice and dice them, and they say panspermia, then you'd say the next question will be, well, what about the two nearest planets to us, Mars and Jupiter? They should have life on them too, if Earth has life from panspermia, and apparently they do. At least Mars does. Now, let's talk about Jupiter. Next. Outside the asteroid belt, there is the planet Jupiter. If you want to really realize how the solar system works, the inner planets of the solar system, Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, they're small and rocky. Beginning at Jupiter, they're what are called gas giants. If you had a big enough bathtub, they would float. Earth and the inner planets would sink in the bathtub. Jupiter, Saturn, Neptune, Uranus, they would float. They're less density than water because they're full of, they're mostly gas. Now, the closest planet to the sun of this group, and by the way, the asteroid belt looks like a area of the solar system. Some people say, oh, an exploded planet or something like that. To me, it just looks like a place where the planet there couldn't figure out, the stuff there couldn't figure out if it wanted to be a small stony planet or a gas giant. So it just didn't form a planet at all. In fact, it got stirred up so much by Jupiter's gravity, it couldn't really form a planet. That's my own thought. But I don't know. I wasn't there. But anyway, so the virtue of Jupiter is that Jupiter is close enough to the sun to get a lot of sunlight to drive a lot of photosynthesis, which is, of course, the main engine of life. It makes its own food, makes oxygen, and then it's eaten by other bugs. So basically, sunlight is the key to this life. So Jupiter is close enough to the sun to get a lot of sunlight, and you would expect life on Jupiter floating around in the clouds, what are called aeroplankton. And aeroplankton is found on Earth. It's near the ground. It's called pollen. We all know about that during hay fever season. But they found bacteria floating almost up into space. Bacterial spores and dust. The Earth is constantly shedding living dust into the solar system. So we would have expected, you would expect the same thing on Jupiter. If panspermia is correct, as you've established in Australia, that's where you made the case, is in Australia. Then you're looking for, does this match the rest of the solar system? Is the rest of the solar system consistent with this? Mars is consistent. Apparently it had life in the past, an ocean and everything, and it still has some kind of life that breathes methane and oxygen. Now, if you go across the asteroid belt, bunch of small, where you can't have really any planets, then you get to Jupiter, where you've got a big planet. Its atmosphere is like 90% hydrogen, and it's got helium, and it's got methane, ammonia, hydrogen sulfide, rotten egg gas, and some other forms of natural gas. And what's interesting is all of those gases I just described are colorless. They don't have any color to them. Next. But this is what Jupiter looks like. It's a riot of colors. It's got a big red spot. It's got white bands. It's got yellow bands. It's got up near the north, you can barely see it in this picture, the clouds are green. What's green? Chlorophyll. What's red? Well, red algae that also is photosynthetic. So you've got a big red spot, you've got orange and white and yellow bands, and what you see to the right is actually a picture of Venus as it would appear to the naked eye if you were in a spaceship approaching Venus. That's what Venus would look like. These pictures they show of Venus with all these swirls and stuff like that, those are taken in ultraviolet, or if they're taken in visible light, they do all sorts of image enhancement to bring out very subtle colors. This is what Jupiter should look like. Completely colorless. This should look like a snowball. I mean, I've looked at Venus through a telescope. You you can't see anything except a faintly yellowish light from it. It's got nothing on it. There's no features, there's no clouds. You can't tell. It just looks like a snowball. It looks like a ping pong ball. And that is what Jupiter should look like unless it was alive. People have said, oh, we should search in the infrared bands for signs of life. You don't need to search in the infrared. All you got to do is look through a telescope with your just a human eye. You can tell that Jupiter is a very lively place because of the colors. Think of the autumn colors. Life is colorful. Think of the peacock. Think of here, I'll show you. Next. Here are brine pools near San Francisco where they let water from the San Francisco Bay into shallow ponds, and they let the air evaporate, the water evaporate. What they're trying to do is harvest salt. This is run by Morton Salt. Now, as the water gets more and more salty, as it evaporates more and more water, and the salt gets more and more concentrated, the brine changes color because there's different types of bacteria that live in the different concentrations of brine. There's green bacteria for lower levels. There's blue bacteria that grows in slightly saltier water. There's brown, of course. That's generally what it looks like when they first let it into the ponds from the bay. Then there's yellow, even saltier. Finally, the most salty, salt-tolerant bacteria that survives when everything else dies because of the salt. By the way, these bacteria are all called halophile, meaning salt-loving bacteria. Why do they live in these ponds? Well, it's too salty for anything else to live. And they do photosynthesis and things like that. So the bright red, that's the saltiest water of all. And that's got a special bacteria in there that can live in 30% salty water. But you can see it's a riot of colors. Every color of the rainbow. And it's just visible to the human eye. And that's what looks like Jupiter. Jupiter doesn't look like a snowball or a ping pong ball. No, it's alive. And because it's alive, it's full of color, because these are the colors of life, living things. Next. Okay. This is apparently the short version of what I sent. I expected a lot more stuff, but that's okay. That's okay. Now, as it turns out, just to summarize, the discovery of very ancient stromatolites, in Australia indicates panspermia. We don't need to argue. We don't need to go to Mars. We don't need to go to Jupiter. We don't need to go to the asteroid belt to argue that. It's really just apparent from the rocks in Australia, because they're full of traces of cyanobacteria, which is, even though it's very ancient, is actually quite sophisticated. It did not arise by spontaneous generation from any primordial soup, especially because it didn't have time to do that. That would have taken billions of years. You basically had blue-green algae in the water forming these stromatolites as soon as there was a liquid ocean. as soon as the water was, low enough temperature so it wasn't boiling all the time, you had this bacteria in it forming these characteristic mineral deposits. So that indicates very early life on Mars, on Earth. And by the way, Mars at this time was probably looked pretty much like Earth. It was getting hit with a lot of asteroids. There were big volcanoes erupting. Later, it formed an ocean. It cooled off and formed an ocean, just like Earth. But conditions on Mars and Earth were pretty much the same at 3.5 billion years ago. So life on Mars had to arrive very quickly too. And the only way you can do that logically is that it fell as spores from space. So the mineral deposits in Australia showing signs of very ancient life, far more ancient than anybody else has found before, indicate panspermia happened because there's no time for life to spontaneously arise out of the primordial soup. There wasn't any primordial soup for most of the first billion years. Then suddenly you've got ocean water and suddenly you've got blue-green algae in it. It's like somebody being born knowing all the works of Shakespeare. It's just so now, so we can make the case for panspermia based just on Earth rock. Now, if you say, well, if that's true, then we should find life, past life, and maybe even present life on Mars and Jupiter because they both get a lot of sunlight like the Earth. There's plenty of energy for life to run and warm temperatures. So what you do is you look at the Ci and Cy meteorites, which apparently come from Mars. They have lots of microfossils in them, and they're rich in organics. So that is consistent with panspermia. So you discover panspermia on Earth, and Mars is consistent with that. Then you go to Jupiter. The clouds have vivid colors, consistent with aeroplankton of various species. That also is consistent then with panspermia. So evidence of life on Mars and Jupiter, past and present, is consistent with panspermia evidence from Earth. Life comes from the stars and did not originate on Earth. You ask me, where did the life originate? That's not my problem. It isn't. It fell from space as spores. As soon as Earth, Mars, and Jupiter were habitable for bacteria, the spores from space landed there and they were fruitful and multiplied. So life comes from the stars, did not originate in the Earth. You say, well, where did it originate? And I say, that's a philosophical problem at this point. It originated sometime in the 13 billion years that preceded, the 10 billion years that preceded the foundation of the Earth, Mars, and the whole solar system. Life somehow originated there in a galaxy far, far away a long time ago. There. How's about that for an answer? It's a philosophical question. This idea that life suddenly spontaneously arose on Earth or even on Mars from some slopping around of a bunch of primordial sloop for a couple billion years, that's a tale for little children to listen to now. That is completely not viable. life began too early on Earth and apparently on Mars for that to be possible. It came from someplace else. The bottom line is we are not alone in the universe. Deal with it.